We started to look at informational text in children's literature, but I wanted to think about how it's specific to social studies today. Informational text, as you read, thinking about nonfiction writing in narrative or non-narrative form that's intended to inform. This comes directly from the Massachusetts Common Core Standards. So we're thinking about that nonfiction text, and it's very prevalent in social studies. Now, when we think about reading in history or social studies, there are a few different types of things that we think about when we do reading. So first of all, there are lots of different types of texts: historical letters, journals, documents, newspapers, artifacts. So we've got our primary sources, and then in our secondary sources we have narrative, informational, explanatory. So different genres and different types of texts. Often our texts are created in the past, or they describe events from the past. And as we've mentioned before, we have to think about sourcing. So who's the author? What's the author's bias when we read? We think about context, what was going on at the time the source was created. Corroboration, so how might the primary source of the document relate to other sources and other texts, other things that we know, so we corroborate information. We think about interpretation and evaluation. We also think about vocabulary and the types of vocabulary that we use in social studies. A lot of times we have obsolete or non-contemporary words or spellings, like the example of the Gilded Age, or metaphors are commonly used. So those are the kinds of things we think about when we do reading in history and social studies that might differ from other subjects. Now, in terms of reading and writing for social studies in Massachusetts, we are bound right now under the Common Core, so under the Common Core ELA standards. Now, again, for elementary, there aren't specific standards for social studies in the Common Core, but under the ELA standards, they are designated and designed to think about social studies as a discipline for pre-K to 5. And the ELA standards, as you've probably come across in your methods course, in your ELA methods courses, are divided into 4 categories. There's reading, there's writing, speaking and listening, and language. And within reading is divided into 3 separate categories as well. It's reading for literature, that has a set of standards, reading informational text with a different set of standards, and reading foundational skills. In this course, we're going to focus primarily on reading, but we will think a little bit about writing and not as much with speaking and listening and language. So I wanted to make sure that you're familiar with the Common Core standards. As again, you should be already familiar with them. I'll put a link on Blackboard to the standards. You should definitely read through them for the pre-K to 5 ELA standards if you haven't done so already. Each set of standards, the reading, the writing, speaking, listening, and language, are divided into sets of anchor standards. So the anchor standards are ideas of what students in all subject levels should know across all grade levels. Then they are specifically divided by grade level for developmentally appropriate standards. The main categories for each, and again, the anchor standards are the same K-12, and they are all divided into the same categories for each standard set, like for reading and for writing. So for reading is divided into 4 main categories. You have key ideas and details, so this gets at the standards related to reading comprehension, reading closely. Close reading is really a key piece of the key ideas and details, which we'll go into in a moment. Craft and structure looks at the organization of a text, so having students interpreting words and phrases as they're used in a text, analyzing the structure of a text, so how ideas change from section to section, or how a text is organized. So informational texts, which we'll talk about, have a lot of key pieces of text features, so that's what craft and structure would look like. And then the standards under integration of knowledge and ideas, that's the evaluation piece. That's really getting into what are those key pieces. So integrating and evaluating content that's presented, how we analyze the material and look at cross texts. And then the last category is the range in reading and level of text complexity. Basically, what that means is thinking about, are the texts that you're using with students appropriate for their grade level, and challenging students. There's this kind of misconceptions that students are not challenged with texts that are difficult enough for them. So the Common Core has tried to elevate the types of text that we use. So that's just make sure we're using a lot of different types of text, so that's the range, and then the level of text complexity, making sure that they are challenging enough for students. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus on informational texts. So this is a section from the standards, from the Common Core ELA standards for pre-K to 5 that looks at the reading standards for informational text. And you can see here how it's broken up. So we go from those anchor standards, which all students, which are the key kind of frameworks, the key ideas, and then now we go into more granular level of what do 4th grade students need to know, what do 5th grade students need to know. And this is also, there's the pre-K, K, 1, 2, and 3 are also listed out. So if we think about what students in 4th and 5th grade need to do for informational text, we'll look at 4th grade. So thinking about details and examples in a text, when explaining what a text says explicitly and when drawing inferences from the text, thinking about explaining events, procedures, ideas based on specific information from the text. We think about craft and structure, determining meaning of academic and domain-specific words or phrases at the 4th grade level, describing the overall structure of a text. So for social studies, we see a lot of chronology, comparisons, cause and effect, so position and solution. So those are things that you'll want to highlight for craft and structure. Comparing and contrasting first-hand and second-hand accounts of the same event. So that's that primary sources and secondary sources, describing differences and focus from the information provided. Then integration of knowledge and ideas. So that's, again, that analysis and evaluation. So interpreting information presented visually, orally, or quantitatively. So this is multiple different types of sources. So having students look at them together. Explaining how an author uses reasons and evidence to support particular points in a text, so claims and evidence, and integrating information from texts on the same topic to write or speak about the topic. So like what you would do with a research paper or a research activity, looking at multiple sources across to create one narrative and one interpretation. And then here's a clear example of what I was mentioning before about the range of reading and text complexity. So by the end of the year, students will read and comprehend informational texts, including history, social studies, science, and technical texts in grades 4 to 5 text complexity band proficiently with scaffolding as needed in the high end of the range. So I'll show you a little bit about how to come to those concepts in a moment. Similar to the reading, these are the anchor standards for writing. I think we'll come back to the writing in another session, but just so you know, the writing has the ideas of text types and purposes, so getting students to write arguments. So there's 3 types of writing that's emphasized in the Common Core. Argumentative writing, that's that first standard under text types and purposes. The second one is information explanatory text, so describing ideas. And then the third type of text is narrative, so writing narratives. And then there's also writing fiction and personal reflections and poetry that Massachusetts added to the standards. The production and distribution of writing really gets at how we do writing, so getting students to produce clear and coherent writing and thinking about development and style, strengthening writing through planning, revising, editing, and rewriting, using technology, so helping students to use technology, which is another piece of today's session, around producing and publishing writing. Collaboration is a big piece too. And then thinking about research to build and present knowledge. So this is really applicable for social studies. So how we get students to conduct short and sustained research projects or activities, gathering relevant information from different types of sources, and how we look at that all together, and that drawing evidence from literary or informational texts to support analysis and reflection in research. You'll see an emphasis again through the Common Core on informational text, since there's this understanding that elementary students in particular haven't been in contact with and haven't used as much informational text, and when they only see nonfiction text, it puts them at a disadvantage by the time they get into middle school and high school, when so much of the reading turns to informational text. So the idea is introducing students at a younger age to more informational texts. Now, getting back to the reading, which is really where we're going to focus our attention to, thinking about one of the pieces of the Common Core that has been a shift from previous instruction is around the idea of close reading. And that's a critical examination of text with repeated reading. So reading something multiple times, usually about at least 3 times. And it's intended for students to assimilate new textual information with their existing background knowledge and prior experiences to expand their schema. So really thinking about how do they use what they're reading in the text and combine it with what they already know. And the idea is also to support students as independent readers, so to let them read from the text and gather information as opposed to just giving them information. So with close reading, there are a couple key features. Challenging students with complex text, so making sure that the text is difficult for students, but not too difficult so that they can't understand any piece of it. We do want them to be challenged and to struggle with the text a little bit. Using short passages of small pieces of text will help students kind of grapple with the complexity piece, so that we're challenging them, but we're challenging them at short passages so that they can get at some of those ideas. Limited front loading, so not giving students too much information before giving them a text. So with a primary source, we might give them a little information about maybe the context around it, but not enough information about what they're actually going to read so that they can figure it out for themselves through the text and ask questions about it. Again, that repeated readings, so that you're going back to the text multiple times so that you're really engaging with the text. Another key feature is text-dependent questions, so asking students questions that are directly related to the text so that they have to read the text to answer the question. Oftentimes people will ask a question about if you're reading Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham, Alabama jail. Sometimes a question might be about that letter of how did someone feel about reading that text? And although that's an important question, you might be able to answer that question without reading the text. The idea is to make students go back to the text so that they're answering a question directly from the text. And then annotation, so having students write their thoughts and think out loud about what they're reading and making notes on it and how to connect things. So those are kind of those key features of close reading. Now, when we think about what sources would be good for either informational text for a close read, you want to think carefully about a few things. First, text complexity. Again, so is it complicated enough so that students can grapple with the text? Not all texts require close reading. Sometimes you just want students to have a quick background read about a paragraph that provides context about a document or about an event. So you might just want them to read that quickly. A dictionary definition does not require close reading most of the time. But more, something substantial and something engaging. You want excerpts that support overall understanding or key ideas or key terms. So what's the most key piece of a document or a source that you want students to think about? And again, those challenging texts. And you could even use challenging texts for the lower grades as a read aloud. So you're still engaging students with complex ideas and complex language, but maybe language that they can't read themselves, but they're being exposed to it through a read aloud. And then also for you, understanding what makes the text complex. So thinking about what do you know about the text and having a really refined understanding of what the text says and knowing why you're using a particular text. So here is a document that we were using with, and I say we, I was using at my job with third and fourth graders. We were going to use this. Now, basically looking at it, you really can't tell what it is. It's actually it's a petition from the Wampanoags in the 6th, 7th, 18th century. And so this is what the original document is. So as I've said before, I always try to show students the original document, but we can't work with this text as it with third graders. So then this is the transcribed version of this text that I was able to find. And even this text, it's a small type. You can read some of it, but it's all smushed together. And there's no way that you could use this with third and fourth graders. So you want to think about how you might adapt a primary source if you're using it for a close read and for informationals as an informational text. So things that you might think about when adapting sources is to focus the attention, creating small chunks. So using ellipses, cutting out pieces of sentences, 200 to 300 words as a maximum for a primary source piece. So thinking about how can you focus it. How can you simplify things? How can you put what kind of conventional syntax, spelling, punctuation? We want students to see that things were written in a different language or were written in different ways than they currently spell things or use syntax. But at the same time, if your purpose is to get students to grapple with the ideas, using conventional syntax, spelling, and punctuation gets students to not be hung up over the syntax and what they don't understand and the spelling, but thinking about, okay, here's more modern language. We want to engage students with the ideas. So it is okay sometimes to simplify primary source documents. And then presentation. You want 16-point font, you want big lettering, and lots of white space so that students can write around the text. Now, here's an example. I wouldn't say it's the best of those criteria that I just set out, but it's a lot better than that first typed text that I showed you. We've got larger font, a little bit more white space. It probably needs more white space. And I've numbered the paragraphs so that students could follow along and so that we can go directly to the text when we're doing a close reading of this. And I just wanted to make a note also about the text complexity. So that's that standard 10 about range and quality and complexity of student reading. Now, the Common Core looks at 3 different pieces to measure text complexity, looking at a qualitative evaluation of a text. So reading the text yourself and thinking, does what this text is asking, its meaning, its structure, its language, does that reasonably sound like something or seem like something that this grade could read, and are these concepts appropriate? So you've got your own evaluation, your own personal evaluation. So taking that as one piece, it's a 3-piece triangle pyramid here. The second piece is thinking about from a quantitative measure. So this is looking at readability measures and other scores of text complexity. So you might be familiar with Lexile readings or degrees of reading power. There are about 6 different types of programs. Fleisch-Kincaid is another one that you can use to find a numeric score of a text, and that's usually based on sentence structure. So how many words are in a sentence, how many sentences are in a paragraph. I will leave a link on our Blackboard page about how to find text complexity quantitative measures. And then the third piece is matching a reader to the text and task. So what reader variables are there? Like, is a student motivated to learn about this? Are they interested? Do they have personal experiences? What's the purpose and the complexity generated by the task assigned? So is it aligned? Is it an authentic kind of match for what you're asking students to read and to do? So those are the 3 key pieces that you want to think about when finding a challenging text for students. So in terms of using the text, now close reading, as I mentioned before, limited front loading, you don't want to give too much information away for students. So thinking about a pre-reading activity is very limited. You might do some background for yourself, but very limited pre-reading and very strategic. So thinking in a focused way, like what is the most important thing that a student needs to know to read this text, but it doesn't give anything too much away. And what kind of student-directed independent pre-reading strategies could you use? So helping students use their own skills of previewing the text, of knowing what they should be looking for, how to anticipate information, looking at organizational structures, so looking at what a document looks like, looking for who the author is, looking for the date or something right away, those sourcing pieces that the students are setting up themselves. You're not giving that information away. And you need to think about what students should already know and have and don't know. So, and how that influences what kind of strategic pre-reading activities you would use. So for the example that I just showed before about the Massachusetts Wampanoag petition, I might start off with a map here that shows different tribal areas at the time, the 1752, when the document was created, so that students at least visually had an understanding of where the Wampanoag tribe was living, and it's something that they wouldn't be able to get from the text. And in terms of vocabulary, you might do a little bit of pre-reading, thinking about what are the words that are absolutely necessary that students wouldn't know to understand this text, but you want to think about doing most of it post-reading so that students can think from context clues what the vocabulary means. So thinking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary. So Tier 2 is at academic language, and then Tier 3 is subject-specific for social studies. So in this example, Tier 2 words that I've used were thinking about descendants, convey, former, so meaning something in the past. So those are all academic language words that they would come across in other readings. And then Tier 3 is more of that subject-specific words. And the vocabulary in Tier 3 for social studies, especially when you're using primary source texts, that gets at some of the older language. Beseech is a word that you're not going to see in context often in 2014. And so then another piece of close reading is thinking about text-dependent questions. So again, questions that require answers from the text. So using textual evidence to make inferences beyond what's written in the text. Now, text-dependent questions can come in a variety of different categories. Fry and Fisher have outlined a few key things that they look at. So when you're thinking about questions, you could look at general understandings, key details, that vocabulary and text structure, the author's purpose, so questions that get at the author's intent, inferences, so asking students to make inferences from the text, and then questions about that get at opinions, arguments, and intertextual connections. So it kind of goes in a progression of first those general understandings, so starting from the bottom, working its way up, so that you know students are comprehending the text, but then really getting at the bigger piece of what's the argument of the text. So another way to think about categories for text-dependent questions goes with the Common Core. So thinking about questions around key ideas and details. So what are the key pieces of the text for basic comprehension, craft and structure, and integration of knowledge and ideas. So key ideas and details. So again, what are the key pieces of the text for basic comprehension? Examples from that text from the Wampanoag document could be, what do you think this document is about? What is the petition? What is a petition? So the definition there. Who are the honorable gentlemen in Boston to whom the Wampanoag people are writing? And that's directly in the text. For what purposes did the Mashpee Wampanoags use their land? And again, these were all from the text. What words in the document tell you this? So you're getting students to look specifically at the text to answer their questions. That second category is craft and structure. So this is around what questions that get at what vocabulary or text structures are significant to understand the text and key historical concepts. So for that document, the craft and structure questions we asked were, what words or phrases did the Mashpee Wampanoags use to complement the gentlemen in Boston, which were the British? Why do you think the authors included compliments in their petition? So again, getting directly at, we're thinking about the text and how it's structured and asking students to think about words and phrases. Then we're getting at arguments. So what arguments did the Wampanoags use to persuade the Massachusetts colonial leaders to help them? And this is all outlined in the And then which of their arguments do you think is best and why? And so that why piece is using evidence to support their claims. The third category is thinking about integration of knowledge and ideas. So these questions are, what aspects of the text can be used to understand broader historical context and concepts? So again, those big picture ideas. So questions from that particular document were questions like, why is the chance to petition the government an important right for people to have? So it's within the text, but you're getting at the bigger ideas. Were the English neighbors being fair to the Wampanoags of Mashpee? So choose a specific example how it supports your opinion. Again, supporting claims with evidence. And then if you were going to petition the mayor and the city council to change one thing about your city or neighborhood, what would it be? Now this last question, it's not text dependent, so it gets at more student personal experiences and relations to text, but it's a connection that we wanted to make to the lesson theme. So if you think about it, what are some of those key ideas? And it directly relates to their now understanding of what a petition is. Another way to engage students with text is to think about what supplemental materials you could use. So for example, I wanted to think about the Constitution. So if you're dealing with the Constitution, particularly the preamble with young students, what kinds of sources would you use as a supplement to help them better understand the text? So again, certainly showing them the original document so that you could ask them just questions about, what are the biggest words on this document page? What does it look like? What do you think this could be? Using picture books to get at the text. So there's the picture book of We the Kids, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, that uses illustrations of day-to-day activities of kids and a couple dogs as illustrating what the concepts behind the preamble are in the Constitution. Having students look at other images. So here, actually, I don't remember if this is the signing of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. I think it's the Constitution. So having them look at original source materials to make connections. Who are the people there? What's going on in this picture? So we've got an original one, and then placing it in more modern understandings of, if we're talking about the concept we the people, what does that mean? So here's what it looked like in 1776, or actually 1783. Here's what it might have looked like in the early 20th century with immigration, and then the kids blowing bubbles. Here's what it could look like today. So what does the concept of we the people mean? And I've just, on this slide, just has the preamble, but again, thinking about, you might use videos. Schoolhouse Rock has a video and a song around the preamble. Again, and it places images with text, so that's another way to help students with like mnemonic devices. Connecting images with historical images and events. So the text, the We the Kids, that's the text in the top left-hand corner of your screen, has the kids and the dogs who were part of the story. They are in a boat and they're replicating the actual image of Washington crossing the Delaware, which is a famous painting from the 1850s. So just showing students that that's what the picture book was making a reference to. Other types of texts we read last week around biography, and I want to think about biography as narrative or informational text. So using biography in the social studies elementary classroom, you want to think about how did the books represent individual events, how are books similar and different if you're looking at multiple types of sources, what type of writing activity would you pair? So ways to teach about biographies, having students research historical accuracy of a biography, so comparing multiple biographies and then doing research, looking at what if and turning points. So asking students questions about what if Martin Luther King didn't give his I Have a Dream speech, or what would have been a turning point, or what was a turning point in his life to make him an activist. Comparing multiple versions, so reading multiple books about the same person. So reading 4 biographies on Martin Luther King Jr. And seeing how they differ and why. Looking at the illustrations there. really thinking like an author, of like making the where is the author visible in a text. So having students think about where is the author's voice, as opposed to where is um, the the person who's the subject of the biography, where is that person's voice. Having students add and create their own sidebars, captions, timelines, and notes. So how would they add to the biography that they're looking at based on other knowledge that they have? So doing more outside research and implement or integrating more additional information to the biography they're reading. And having students think about simple questions without simple answers. So reading like a writer, like why did the author choose to put this story in as opposed to another story? We also deal in social studies a lot with secondary sources, particularly as informational text. So this is where you think about more of the traditional textbooks in social studies. So thinking about strategies to help make meaning from nonfiction texts, pointing out textbook conventions, which in the children's literature section of this week's session, you'll think about text features for informational text. So what are those and how do you help students learn how to read those things? Again, looking at multiple accounts with both secondary sources and integrating primary sources. Helping students pre-learn the content, so activating their prior knowledge before they're reading a text, doing a read aloud and a picture book read aloud before looking at a textbook, making predictions, a student-centered exploration of the text, so just before they even start to read, just have them look through the text and look at the different types of organizational structures of a textbook, or again, a more dense informational text. What I just mentioned around supplemental visuals, um, thinking about what kind of vocabulary you'll need to scaffold students' attention to and to help them understand the vocab, graphic organizers, which I'll point out in a moment, and then study guides with student input, places where students can record their thoughts and annotate their ideas as they're reading a text. As I mentioned, again, the textbook conventions, thinking of the structure of the book, titles, headings, captions, index, glossary, teaching students to scan text and locate information. So those are key features of informational text that students need to be able to understand. And then thinking about vocabulary. So with the vocabulary in social studies, we have a lot of different I wouldn't, maybe not necessarily different, but vocabulary structures and ideas that tend to show up more in social studies. So we have a lot of technical terms, so thinking about the idea of a century, longitude, poles, legislature. So thinking about technical terms, figurative terms. So words, especially for your ELL students, that these words might not necessarily mean what they literally say. So Cold War is a good example. What does that really mean? Is it physically cold? So getting students to think about what figurative terms might show up. Words with multiple meanings. So mouth, a person's mouth, or the mouth of a river, which is a geography term. So thinking about what those different concepts that have multiple meanings. So bank, a physical financial institution, or the bank of a river. So again, ELLs in particular need help in scaffolding words with multiple meanings. Locality-specific terms too, especially with geography and even just learning about events in a particular geographical context. So these are two southern words about a bio or grits. So getting students in the north to know what those words are. So thinking about where you're located and where your students are located and what the text may make reference to. Again, with ELLs, particularly thinking about alike words, so peasant and pheasant, principal and principal, alien and allies. So just being prepared to point those terms out. And acronyms, we use a lot of acronyms in social studies, which some of it you might not get into as much context with elementary students. But again, thinking about how do we scaffold around those types of use of language. Quantitative terms, century, decade, GNP, acre, thinking about how you, making students aware of the type of nature of what quantitative terms are. And then names. So that's another piece of vocabulary that we come across in social studies. Lewis and Clark, what does revolution or the revolution, Gettysburg. And also thinking about vocabulary in naming biases. So, for example, freedom fighter versus terrorist. Whose definition is which? What does that mean? I always ask people too, what's the American War? And the American War is what many people in Vietnam call the Vietnam War. So thinking about why things might be named is also an important piece to point out to young students. So is it the Civil War, or is it the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression? And that gives you a point of view of who's asking the question and who's using the terms. So for vocabulary techniques, and I'm sure you've gone through a lot with your ELA classes, but thinking about these are just a few ideas. Picture clues of showing a picture, having experience clues, so relating an experience for students with the vocabulary, comparison and contrast clues. So the president vetoed the first bill, but he allowed the second to become law, so you're comparing and contrasting. Synonym clues, so using different words that mean the same thing. So the Democratic Party adopted its platform. This plan must be voted on by the delegates to the convention. So platform and plan as synonym clues. Summary clues, so adding more piece of a summary around a piece of a definition or a word. So what people know and believe to be true, how they act, are all part of their culture. So we're defining culture through the summary of what we believe to be true and how they act. And then definition clues. To lobby is to accost, to solicit a legislator in order to influence legislation to one's own advantage. So specifically providing the definition in the sentence. Thinking about concept maps for students, so giving examples and non-examples with the definition and writing a word in a sentence. So here for government, if we were using a language objective of students will define the concept of government and identify 3 different types of government. We've got the word in the center, we've got examples, we have non-examples, the definition, and then a sentence. Picture clues too, and conceptual kind of graphic organizers around a definition. So here we're still working on government. So we look at different types of government and different structures and how they impact our lives. So making self connections to the concepts. So looking at it at the school, local, state, and federal level. So you might have students, especially ELL students, turn to their neighbor and describe one experience or interaction that they've had with government, and think about whether it was at the school level, the local level, the state level, or the federal level, and then maybe retell their neighbor's experience to the class. And so you're having students then practice language speaking skills that they've already internalized because they've already had a conversation. And then another key thing around literacy with social studies for informational text is thinking about graphic organizers and study guides, how you can help students visualize relationships, determine purpose, determine the level of support, think about what flowing. I have followed the flow of the chapter or the text, so having students input material and information around the first part of the text and read, and as they go along the text, they're continually adding to something for a graphic organizer and a study guide. Something that helps them with prediction and monitoring reading, skill guides that will help them emphasize key concepts and main ideas, connections to their lives, and then summary strategies, so summarizing the text and main ideas. So these you're probably very familiar with, but graphic organizers such as KWL charts, things that will assume and anticipate, so what students already know and what they'll predict what will happen. Graphic organizers that get at position and pattern, so this is like cause and effect for students, especially in social studies, or using a timeline for patterns of pictures. And this, so a good timeline example here, using images for young students around with the timeline. I would add text to that as well. Graphic organizers that group and organize things, so in a visual way. So we've got a pyramid. You see a lot of pyramid, cubes, those different types of geometrical shapes. So thinking about this will help students understand the relationships of plants and animals and where they live. And then the traditional Venn diagram of comparing and contrasting concepts so that they see overlap and they see similarities and differences there. So this is actually just a pretty, somewhat long overview of some different strategies and literacy strategies with social studies, particularly around informational text.